Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 69, part 1, for Sunday the 26th of January 2020. And this week's movie is the 2008 pick, Frost Nixon, starring Michael Sheen and Frank Langella as David Frost and former President Richard Nixon. It details the series of interviews conducted between the two, recorded in 1977. My name is Andrew Blischik, and with me as ever is Martin Darlington. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Andrew. Welcome back. Happy New Year, everybody who hasn't heard us say that so far, and of course to you and Janine and the extended feline and canine family.
Back at you two and the family and Sharon.
Sharon Amir at home is looking for a job, and Sharon's trying to show her how to run a household because she's going to be running the house whilst we're out here in Qatar. So I'm looking forward to the missus coming back. In Updates in Errata, I can't remember which of the lovely listeners made a comment recently, but referenced an outtakes clip we published a long time ago, which I'm struggling to remember actually what it was. And also, conversely, several emails have commented on how fluent we sound. They don't talk over each other. And I'm thinking, well, actually, we do. So in the interests of openness and for a slight giggle, I extracted a bunch of ums and ahs made by me during the recording of the Richard III episode, which Derek Burke so kindly joined us for. And you'll hear Derek at the end having a chuckle. This is how we make ourselves sound fluent, because this is what's extracted through the medium of an audio editing suite. Wow. On the
Thank you very much, Martin. On to news and reviews. The website historybyhollywood.com has been updated with the planned episode page reflecting our next few movies, but should this episode, Frost Nixon, take us only 2 episodes, we're going to have a fallow week, as the earliest we can get the next episode, The Social Network, out will be the 16th of February, so apologies for that if it pans out as we expect.
And just a quick mea culpa, that one's down to me, I'm afraid. I'm flying home next week, back to the UK for just over a week, and it won't be possible during that period to get the show out. So hopefully Andrew and I can drag our waffling out for 3 episodes, but if not, we may have to have a fallow week. In listener feedback, our good friend Dr. Phil Pomerantz wrote in the aftermath of Henry V, and in response to my difficulties in saying Dame Judi Dench, and he'd heard a story about Dame Judi. He said, if you don't mind some profanity, but don't worry, we'll self-edit or self-censor that one. He says, as you may or may not know, she's losing her vision from macular degeneration. Now, I didn't know that, and it's dreadfully sad, but he said she was crossing the street one day and walked in front of a moving car. The driver stood on his brakes and yelled out of his window. Now, you're going to have to imagine the worst swear word you can. He shouted, watch where you're going, you stupid bleep. And she replied, that's Dame stupid bleep to you, which I thought was absolutely delightful. Now, Phil also mentioned a forthcoming fact-based movie called The Three Christs, about 3 institution inmates who all believe they're Jesus. And it is fact-based, apparently. It could be interesting. And we also need to say hello to Phil's brother David, who's joined our Twitterati following on Twitter following at History by Hwood. So hello David, and you're very welcome.
Indeed.
So the Pomerantz clan are gathering.
Thank you very much. We also had a wonderfully detailed email from long-term supporter Gary Shavit, who has just watched Ford versus Ferrari, which we've slated as a forthcoming episode due out in late March or early April. And Gary has shared a host of great research paths down which we will merrily toddle in our search for the truth. It's fair to say that Gary, remembering the events portrayed in the movie and something of an expert on motorsports, was quite lively in his comments. So thank you as always for your detailed interest, Gary. And finally, we've had a heartwarming email came in from Joe Knight Dutkevich, a Brit living in Vancouver who's recently discovered the show and is in full binge listening catch-up mode. Did you want to introduce her words there?
Yeah, Jo had said that she wasn't really that into movies, preferring books or audio for learning about history. But she writes, "Your series has ignited my interest in historic movies, and I've now watched some classics that I would not otherwise have sought out. I can only imagine quite how much research and time goes into the pod, so please know it is appreciated. I've never before felt compelled to write in anywhere, so please take heed in the knowledge that my reserved, nay, repressed English heart was so moved. Keep on keeping on." Jo's got to the Cleopatra show, and she said she's really enjoying it. And so we should also mention her middle son, Ptolemy Daniel, and a niece, Cleo Jemima. So hello, Ptolemy and Cleo.
Well,
they are 11 and 5 respectively. And Jo tells us that both children are inquisitive, compassionate and brave in ways that are a testament to their namesakes. Now we hope that Cleo isn't too brave or inquisitive when it comes to venomous snakes, but it's great to hear that those names are living on, and I can only imagine the chuckles that Ptolemy will enjoy through his life as people try and work out how to spell his name. So Jo, thank you so much.
let's start with the story of the movie of Frost Nixon. Frost Nixon was directed by veteran and favourite of the podcast, Ron Howard, and it was adapted from a 2006 play written by Peter Morgan, who also wrote the screenplay for this movie, which was released in 2008. Morgan had already written the screenplay for the movie The Queen, which featured Welsh actor Michael Sheen as Prime Minister Tony Blair, along with two other lesser-known movies that also starred Sheen as Blair. Morgan cast Sheen as the British talk show host David Frost in this movie, and this is the same role that Sheen had performed on stage in Morgan's play. And they would also work together in another movie called Damned United, the story of football manager Brian Clough's turbulent and brief period managing Leeds United. Sheen is the son of a part-time Jack Nicholson impersonator and is famed for his ability to get inside the skin of the characters he's playing, going far beyond a talent to mimic accents and quirks of speech.
Yeah, Morgan, he also would work with director Ron Howard on Rush, which was featured in HBH episode 2, and he's also is the writer of the TV series The Crown, which certainly in the UK is enormously popular. This is following the lives of the current British royal family. I think it started around the First or Second World War, and they're into season 2, or it might even be 3. I've not been watching it. Sharon has, and she absolutely loves it. And what they do is everything that is publicly known, supposedly, is very accurate, and then conversations between royal family members behind the scenes are clearly imagined. But yeah, apparently very, very good. And Peter Morgan is the writer on that. The other main character in both the play Frost Nixon and the movie is played by Frank Langella, who, like Michael Sheen, had played the same role in the stage play. So I think it's quite unusual to have the two leading characters from a stage play making the transfer to film quite so successfully.
It does happen every now and again, but you do hear of people swapping around, like, I forget, some of the musicals from the 60s ended up having breakthrough stars like Barbra Streisand instead of the original performers on the stage. But yeah, I think it is quite rare that they've made these roles their own and have played them for many years in both, I think, London and New York, and now on the screen. The movie was made for a budget of $25 million and pulled in a relatively modest $28 million at the box office, but it's also made an additional $7 million in DVD sales, so let's say it's a comfortable success, making nearly $10 million on top of the production costs. Rotten Tomatoes rates the movie as a 93% thumbs up from critics and 88% from the audiences, and it's worth noting that famed US critic Roger Ebert has rated it 4 out of 4. For him, that's a rare accolade.
Yeah, I was thinking about the budget. I mean, that's a 12% return. That's just from box office receipts. If you were making a business investment, that you'd think that's pretty good. If you got a bank account that paid 12% interest, you'd think, wow, I like this. So it's funny how we view it. If they don't double their money, we're like, well, yeah, it was a success, but it wasn't great.
And I assume they made more money since the days of streaming services, where we might have both paid a subscription service to watch it on top of the DVD sales.
Yeah, I'm sure. It was shot on various locations, and Ron Howard appears to have taken great pains to get the feel of the locations correct, even if some of the details are not quite completely correct. I read one comment said, "Oh, there's the shots of the Sydney Harbour Opera, the Sydney Opera House in the background when David Frost is hosting his Australian TV show. Some of the buildings nearby weren't built until 1998." I'm thinking, okay, does that detract whatsoever from the...
No, but as an Australian viewer, I saw those apartment buildings that had incredible controversy 15, 20 years ago, and knew straight away as an Australian that that's historically inaccurate, but as you say, detracted nothing from the tension of what is a very entertaining movie.
No. It was nominated for a host of Academy Awards, Golden Globes and BAFTAs, including Best Picture, Best Director and Best Actor for Frank Langella for Nixon, but it won none of any of the big ones. Slumdog Millionaire won Best Picture and Best Director, and Best Actor went to Sean Penn for Milk, which is not a film I've seen. Actually, I've not seen Slumdog Millionaire yet either. I really should do, I think. Both Blake and movie have been critically acclaimed by stage and cinema critics, although supporters of the late ex-president in the form of Richard Nixon have hammered it for inaccuracies throughout the film. Apparently he does have supporters, which, sometimes you get the feeling that he probably doesn't. So, shall we launch into the synopsis and the reality? And I do have to say, hats off to Andrew for this. Do you have any idea how many hours of the actual interviews you ploughed through in researching this?
No, I got David Frost's book from 2007 that he released after the fact, when the movie and the play had started to take off, and they've got transcripts at the back, so I was managed to read through most of those, and I did watch some of the interviews on YouTube, as you say. I do tend to enjoy anything related to US politics in our episodes, but I quite enjoyed the whole experience. It was detailed, as you might have guessed, but it was very enjoyable.
Oh, good. But chapeau to you, sir.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
So, opening the movie, we see archival news footage from the early 70s giving us a potted introduction to the names and voices of the Watergate scandal. G. Gordon Liddy, John Ehrlichman, H.R. Haldeman and others get mentioned, and as the news footage progresses, the images become interspersed with some of the actors about to appear in these roles, including Frank Langella as President Nixon. The news footage culminates with the resignation of President Nixon. Before we see Nixon resign, we meet some of the characters to appear in the movie, including Sam Rockwell as the investigative journalist Jane Reston Jr., Matthew McFadden as British TV producer John Burt, and Oliver Platt as journalist Bob Zelnick. It's Zelnick's character that tells us a few years after the Nixon resignation, which we've just seen, Zelnick will be involved with Nixon and a most unlikely crusader for the political truth, a British TV presenter named David Frost. We then cut to an Australian TV studio where David Frost, played by the very versatile Michael Sheen, is getting ready to present a live, light-hearted variety show to his Australian audience. We see Frost in the studio watching the momentous news of Nixon's resignation. Frost watches Langella as Nixon board Marine One and depart their White House lawn. The camera then cuts to the helicopter and we see a somber Nixon fly over to the Washington Monument for the last time. For the last time to his retirement in California. And then we get a voiceover from Nixon's Chief of Staff, Jack Brennan, played by the ubiquitous Kevin Bacon, remembering how momentous this event was for all Americans. We then see Frost back in Sutraya. Fascinating.
Australia.
Oh, sorry. I was thinking, that's one of your really clever words that I don't know what it means.
No, just pure typo on my part.
And there's the next outtakes bit. We then see Foss back in Australia, fascinated by the worldwide spectacle that Nixon's departure has become, and clearly he has an idea brewing. So, setting up. Give us some background, Andrew.
Yeah, so we've got the two main protagonists, Frost and Nixon, and the pivotal event that ropes Frost in, and that's this momentous resignation. So let's set the scene for those two protagonists. Richard Milhouse Nixon was born in rural California in 1913. Nixon himself had been born into a modest Quaker family and was raised under Quaker principles, including no alcohol, no swearing, and no dancing. He was one of 5 boys, and as a youth was fairly frail. 2 of his brothers, I think, died of TB while they were young, and as a result Richard was barred from any vigorous sports due to fears of a similar respiratory infection. His father eventually ran a grocery store, and due to family illnesses, Richard had to decline his first scholarship, which was offered to Harvard. He declined this in order to support the family grocery business. He was clearly intelligent and hardworking, and he eventually finished his first degree at the top of his class and was offered a law degree scholarship at the prestigious Duke University in one of the Carolinas. Nixon then went on to practice law in his home state of California and married the love of his life, Patty, in 1940. As a bit of an aside, they had a very strange courtship and she resisted his affections for a long time. He fell in love with her at first sight and said he would marry her and hung around her wherever he could, and ended up driving her with dates that were unsuccessful eventually. He wore her down after many years. And, they got married and had a loving and successful marriage from all we can see. The war broke out not long after they married. The American War broke out not long after they married, when they got married in 1940. And Nixon then had a successful military career in the Navy during World War II and was elected to a federal congressional seat in California in 1945. 4 years later, in 1949, he ran for the California Senate, and he started to use some of his tricky campaigns, printing leaflets of his opponents on pink paper at the suggestion that either that candidate or one of his brothers may have been homosexual. So this is the first time he gets the nickname Tricky Dicky for using pretty underhanded and tough electoral tactics. In November 1952, he gets onto the ticket for the Eisenhower presidential campaign as the vice president. Eisenhower wins, so for the next 8 years, Nixon is vice president, and then he runs for president against JFK in 1960, a race that he narrowly lost. He's 47 at the time, and he returns to California after the unsuccessful presidential campaign to lick his wounds. A few years later, in 1967, much to his wife's disappointment, Nixon announced that he would try to run for president again in the 1968 presidential election. 1968 were turbulent times and very unpredictable times, which you can evidence if you want to listen to episode 7 of History by Hollywood, Selma, showing how turbulent and violent that could be. And to make a long story short, Nixon in 1968 won a handsome victory using some controversial tactics along the way. There's his infamous Southern strategy, which is sort of barely disguised racism to bring Democratic voters over to the Republicans down south. In 1972, when he stood for re-election, he was re-elected in a landslide. And despite his considerable achievements in ending the war in Vietnam and recognising communist China, he's gone down in history as perhaps the most controversial US president due to the Watergate scandal. Now, there are libraries of books and several separate podcasts on Watergate alone, so in a very short summary, it's a scandal about a break-in to the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., where the offices of the Democratic Party's headquarters are being held, and this is prior to his 1972 re-election. The Washington Post broke the news that this was not a simple robbery, but an attempt by Nixon's Republicans to bug the offices of their opponents, the Democrats, in preparation for that 1972 election. Eventually, it was proven that Nixon and his White House were behind the break-in and spent many months later covering this fact up. Eventually, the US Congress was set to impeach Nixon, and as is the case currently for Trump, the House of Representatives, the lower house, voted yes to impeach the president, but unlike as it seems with Trump, it looks certain that the US Senate, the upper house, would follow suit, and Nixon was set to become the first ever president removed by an impeachment process through the parliament. And it was just before this could happen, a few days or even less, that Nixon decided that rather than suffer this indignity of being the first US president impeached by both houses of parliament, he would resign instead and this occurred on the 9th of August 1974, as we've just seen Frost's character watching from a TV studio in Australia.
Right, so it was 74 that he resigned.
Using the years, but yeah, 74 was when he would have stood down, and then 77, 3 years later, was when they conducted the Frost-Nixon interviews.
Fascinatingly, in one of those little HBH connection things, when we realise that the events shown in any film don't happen in isolation, his opponent, whose offices were being bugged, the Democratic presidential nominee for 72 was George McGovern, who we saw played by Tim Roth in the movie Selma, as a horrible racist, only really going along with the civil rights, or protecting the civil rights protesters, because he ended up having absolutely no choice. And yet, and I think it's like you pointed out here, it's worth remembering that Abraham Lincoln, who signed the Emancipation Declaration, was a Republican, the first Republican president. And you had this thing where the southern states that we now think of as firmly Republican were actually, for a century, were firmly Democratic, to the point they got called the Dixiecrats. And it was the Republicans who were seen as the progressive and, more sort of...
civil rights.
What's the word? Yeah, pro-civil rights.
Yeah, and it was Nixon's Southern strategy that kind of dog-whistled a lot of issues that brought the southern states into the Republican fold for, as you say, the first time in about a century. And it could be argued that every other Republican president since has sort of stoked those fires and those fears and brought the South along increasingly as the American elections roll by. So Nixon was extremely influential, and he was a very hardball politician, and he had a lot of achievements, the good and bad, but as we say, everything is overshadowed by this Watergate controversy. David Frost was born in 1939, so by the time of Nixon's resignation, he was 32 or 33. David Frost's father was a Methodist preacher, and it seems he had a comfortable middle-class English life. He graduated from Cambridge in 1959, where he spent some time with the theatre group called Footlights, which has been incredibly influential in British comedy principally. When he was there, he worked with British comedy legends Peter Cook and Jonathan Miller, and appeared on some local TV comedy programs. In 1962, he was selected to host a new satirical TV show called That Was the Week That Was. This show, it caught the zeitgeist of those rebellious 60s, and it's become the prototype for any other satirical news show that's followed all the way around the globe. Lots of them in my country and in England and America, and they all pretty much follow the mould of taking the mickey out of the politicians and what they'd done in the previous week, and that was the week that was. Frost then moved on to host another satirical news show, which was called The Frost Report, and this show started the careers of comedians such as Ronnie Barker, Ronnie Corbett, John Cleese, and eventually what would become most of the cast of Monty Python's Flying Circus. Frost then moved on to host and produce a lot of movies and TV shows. Some of them were light-hearted and others more serious. And in 1968, he moved to America and made some successful interview programs there, most featuring celebrities like Jack Benny, Tennessee Williams, and eventually the retired President Richard M. Nixon. Now, the movie makes a big deal about the fact that he was a talk show host. He was light-hearted. He wasn't a hard-hitting journalist. He was trying to reinvent himself along those paths, and let's dive into the movie to see how successful he was using the Nixon interviews as the vehicle for credibility for him.
Yeah, sure. It's 2 weeks after the resignation, and it's worth saying when he's on set in his Australian TV show, and they're watching the TV behind, backstage, when Nixon resigned, and he immediately says, "Why is he doing it at 9 a.m? His West Coast audience are all still in bed." So you can see that David Frost understands television as a medium of communication, and that's his first thought, isn't so much the drama of the resignation itself. He said, but surely if he wants a big TV audience to watch him. So, I don't know, maybe he didn't want...
Maybe he didn't. Maybe he didn't.
Maybe he didn't want his Californian constituents to see him having to
Exactly.
do that, and that was why he did it. So in the movie, it's 2 weeks after the resignation, we see Frost in London pitching an idea to his longtime friend, TV producer John Burt. They're in a down-market cafeteria in London's ITV studios, and Frost had been part of a consortium that successfully paid for the franchise of the new station, created as a commercial rival to the BBC. He pitches an idea to Burt of a series of interviews with the retired president, and he says he wants John Burt to be the producer. Burt can't really believe that Nixon's people would consider a deal with what they will view as the lightweight David Frost. Burt says the only thing any audience would want is a Watergate confession. We then see Burt giving an after-the-fact interview to the camera, a device Ron Howard uses throughout the movie to progress the narrative. He tells us that negotiations were delayed due to Nixon's health, and then we see a hospitalised Richard Nixon, as Burt helpfully informs us that Nixon was actually very interested in the possible interviews to address the still white-hot controversy of his involvement in the Watergate robbery and cover-up. Burt reminds us that Nixon's involvement will never become a matter for the courts, because Nixon's successor, former Vice President and now, in 1974 this is, current President Gerald Ford, issued a full and unreserved pardon to Nixon in September 1974, about 4 weeks after the resignation.
So there's a lot in that, and I think we've said, as you mentioned, that there's this technique in the movie where one of the characters sort of leaps forward a year or two and tells us what was happening in the scenes we're about to see. And it's a good device because Gerald Ford's pardon of Nixon was a huge controversy at the time, but it's handled very quickly and deftly in a few sentences here.
Yeah, I mean, it's very effectively done. It could be potentially very confusing, these jumping about in timelines, but very similar to The Social Network, which I've just watched and started the notes on for the next episode. They do that as well. You jump forward and back. And actually, it works really well when it's done really well. So
let me just comment on those couple of scenes. So far we've got Burt, and I've mentioned Brennan, who's Nixon's former chief of staff. And so far, and I think pretty much throughout the movie, all the characters they show are real people, and they're correctly shown as part of either Nixon's or Frost's own orbits. So they're pretty accurate on that regard as far as the characters they write in. There's no amalgamation characters from what I recall, for example. The movie does make a big deal about how Nixon wanted to use these interviews to clear his name and set the historical record straight, and so that people will focus on his other achievements and not just the Watergate scandal. And Nixon, in fact, did think he might be able to achieve this using a lightweight talk show host like David Frost. So this part of the story that expands out going forward is pretty much correct. An important part of the movie story is that despite Nixon's desires, that a determined and well-prepared Frost ends up getting the better of the wily ex-president. But the truth of the matter might be a little bit different, as we'll get to discuss later.
Yeah, and the pardon, you've mentioned it. Was it, because it almost appears that, Nixon's going to hospital, he might be about to die, he might be very ill, we're not sure, obviously we know he didn't because he went on to do these interviews, but you could imagine that at the time, it's almost trying to suggest that Gerald Ford said, look, he's an old man, he's very ill, I'm going to pardon him, but actually, the pardon happened before he went to hospital.
Yeah,
is that right?
It's amazing to think that this most controversial of presidents that is condemned for breaking the law and covering it up, he gets pardoned only like 4 weeks after he resigns, and but in fact the hospitalisation happened a little bit later. It happened another month after that. So he resigned, and then a month later got pardoned, and then a month later ended up being hospitalised. But it's quite okay for them to compress those facts to make it a little bit dramatic when he sees him being pardoned on TV while he's in hospital. Yeah. And Gerald Ford himself has been, the suggestion was that he said, I'll resign and make you my vice president, provided that you, as a quid pro quo, pardon me of any wrongdoings. And there is no real evidence of that. And Gerald Ford in later life said, look, I had to do it. Everyone was talking about Watergate and nothing else. Will he be charged? Will I pardon him? No, we couldn't do anything in the government. The only thing I could do just to close the book and move on was I had no other choice other than to pardon him, which is very interesting.
Back to the movie. Cut to the recuperating Nixon at his vacation home in California, and it's some 3 months later. His agent, Swifty Lazar, wonderfully played by Toby Jones, a very strange-looking fella, and journalist Diane Sawyers, played by Kate Jennings Grant, are talking to him, and Lazar says he sold Nixon's memoirs for over $2 million. Nixon says the memoirs are his best chance to put the record straight on his administration. Lazar has some extra news on that front, saying that they've had an offer from Frost to interview him, and he's willing to pay, I think it was, wasn't it 500,000 initially?
Yeah, 500.
And Swifty Lazar says CBS are only offering 350,000. Oh, and by the way, he's a lightweight, this David Frost. You'll nail him to the wall. This is confirmed as we cut to Frost's Sydney TV show, where he's introducing an escape artist about to be lowered into Sydney Harbour. And then we get brief scenes of Lazar bullying Frost at all hours into offering 500,000 and then an extra. And Nixon says to him, "Do you think you could get 550?" And we cut back to Lazar saying, "I got 600,000." So Nixon sold. And it's interesting to show that he does come across in the movie as being, it's difficult, greedy or business-minded. He wants the best deal he can get, and money is clearly quite important. So Frost, tempted by real success in the US and a chance to put his stamp on his, being taken as a serious journalist, he's got to pony up this massive amount of money from his own pocket, because initially no US television station is willing to carry the interviews, partly because they were outbid by a Brit and they're angry about it, and also they have this thing of, I'm sorry, no, we don't pay for interviews, because that just skews the entire sort of premise of interviewing a public figure.
So
how did they do?
Well, they did okay, yeah. We've seen this one motivation we mentioned already of Nixon really wanting to give his side of the Watergate story, namely so that his history can move on from the scandal and focus on his more positive achievements. But here we're getting another more pressing motive, as you say, money. And by this time, in fact, Nixon was broke. He hadn't signed any book deals, nothing was confirmed, and any ongoing future income, consultancies or the like was unknown. Lazar says that Frost is offering double what the more reputable media channels are offering, but apparently in reality it was triple. So what Frost was offering was a huge carrot to bring Nixon on board for the interviews. And the $600,000 figure that they agreed on is correct. And if you Google it, you'll find that that's the equivalent of $3.5 million in today's dollars. So not a shabby amount at all, and would have tempted anyone, including Nixon, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'd do that.
Yeah,
I'd be interviewed for $3.5 million.
12 hours.
If anyone's interested out there, just drop us a line and we'll set it up. In fact, yeah, you can get me and Andrew and we'll share the $3.5 million. That's absolutely fine. Frost, back to the movie. Frost is jetting out to America, first class on a jumbo jet. It'll be a British Airways 747. And he starts chatting to and then woos a lady called Caroline Cushing, played by Rebecca Hall. They banter flirtatiously during the flight and hit it off. And then Frost asks her to join him when they land and come and meet Richard Nixon. And she leaps at the chance, making us wonder, what was she flying there for? She seems free to just, go off with this glamorous journalist or TV guy. So then we get Caroline's character talking in the past tense. This is using this interview summarisation again. She summarises that the trouble's convincing the established networks to get on board, all being sceptical, and the fact that David Frost has no takers at all to cover his $600,000, plus, of course, all the expenses of putting these interviews together. Next, we see Caroline, Frost and John Burt arrive at La Casa Pacifica, which is Nixon's Californian retreat, and they meet Nixon for the first time. Lazar, Brennan and Nixon emerge to greet the three of them, and Nixon tries to charm them with anecdotes about Leonid Brezhnev, who was the General Secretary of the Soviet Union at the time. And he ends with the ironic comment that, you wouldn't want to be a Russian leader, you never know if you're being taped. As they part, Nixon raises the stakes, saying their interviews will be a no-holds-barred duel. Before he goes, Frost signs a cheque for $200,000 as down payment for the $600,000 fees, but we now know that there are no sponsor dollars covering that cheque. Nixon's final words of advice to Frost are to marry Caroline, because she lives in Monaco, so if he moved there he wouldn't have to pay any taxes. Once he's gone, Brennan and Nixon discuss Frost's finances, which are probably parlous, and his dress sense, which Nixon feels is too effeminate. And we sense that the Nixon camp feel they've got Frost over a barrel, if not several barrels. So, Caroline Cushing, real person?
Yes, Caroline is a real character. She's actually portrayed in the movies. She and Frost were an item for some 5 years, from 1974. She was his companion on much of his work, including when he went to Zaire to interview Muhammad Ali and George Foreman before their Rumble in the Jungle fight. She went with him to interview him in Australia for Neil Diamond, with Neil Diamond, where Neil Diamond apparently sang to Caroline, Sweet Caroline, making her feel very special. And she also dined with him when he met British Prime Minister at the time, Harold Wilson. And as the movie correctly shows, she was with him in Beverly Hills for all the interview preparations, and she joined Frost for a dinner party, which we'll see in the movie later, hosted by Nixon at his La Casa Pacifica estate. So they've done a pretty good job with Caroline.
Except she'd already been an item with David Frost for some years before the Nixon interviews, wasn't she? So they didn't meet on the way out. But it's a clever device of showing how they get together. Sorry, I've got a cat trying to climb onto my laptop.
They are laying it on with a trowel that there's dollar signs in Nixon's eyes, though, aren't they? It's all about the money. He even tells, we have no evidence that this is true, tells Frost to marry Caroline because she lives in tax-free Monaco, and we don't even know if that's a fact or not. But they're really putting it on thick that it's money that's motivating Nixon to do this in the main. I don't know whether that's true or not.
I suppose if he had no form of income and he wanted to keep himself and Patty in the style to which they'd become accustomed. I mean, the government, I believe that former presidents have a Secret Service detail for the rest of their lives, so he wouldn't have had to pay for that. But yeah, difficult to tell, like you say. So back to the movie. As things stand, there are no financial backers, and Frost has had his Australian show cancelled, so it's kind of crunch time. John Burt thinks the project's dead, but Frost won't let it go and devises a plan where the production team would act as the TV studio. They'd make the interviews and then sell it to other studios in syndication. Although we've met them before because of the flashback narrative device in the movie, we now see Frost meeting investigative journalist James Reston Jr., played by Sam Rockwell, and journalist Bob Zelnick, Oliver Platt plays him, for the first time. And these are the principal researchers in preparing Frost for the interviews. But Reston has written several books about Nixon. He hates Nixon, he despises what he's done, and he really wants to know what Frost's motivation is. And it's a really good scene because David Frost is saying, well, we'll get thousands of viewers. We're looking at, over 20 hours of interviews. Isn't that enough? He's not looking at the outcome, whereas Reston wants to know, hang on, I want justice for the thousands of Americans and the millions of Vietnamese and Cambodians that have died under his leadership. I've got no sympathy for the SOB. He's damaged the credibility of the presidency, American democracy itself. He said so he wants to see him nailed. And he also mentions, look, within the Washington press, your project is a joke. So Zelnick and Reston leave for a private chat to debate whether they're going to continue with the team, whilst Frost and Burt on their own do the same. I mean, this whole business of raising the money could look like a movie device to ramp up the tension. Is it? Is this right?
Yeah, it is pretty much correct. They were living on the edge and trying to come up with new business models within the TV industry. He was in trouble because the networks refused to stump up any of the cash. And as we've already mentioned, the movie suggests Frost had the wrong image for some hard-hitting interviews, and that is all correct. And in the end, the project, as we'll see, was pretty much financed by Frost himself, or calling in some personal favours and getting friends to stump up the cash for him. As we've mentioned, everybody that appears in the movie, including James Reston Jr. and Bob Zelnick, are real people, and Reston, as is shown in the movie, was really a rabid anti-Nixoner. As you've mentioned, he wrote several books about him. He's a prolific writer of fiction and other non-fiction works, not just around Nixon. And in 2007, he got on the bandwagon of this play and the movie, writing 2007's The Conviction of Richard Nixon, the untold story of the Frost-Nixon interviews. He would have been very keen, as the movie suggests, to skewer Nixon in the Frost interviews. Maybe not quite as gung-ho as Rockwell suggests in the movie, but the essence is correct. He was a well-regarded journalist and very anti-Nixon.
Yeah, interesting. So back to the movie, we see Richard Nixon, who was a guest speaker at a black tie dinner, and he's putting in a fairly pedestrian speech. afterwards, and we don't see the question and answer session, but there clearly was one, and he blows up at Jack Brennan, the Kevin Bacon character, his chief of staff, saying, "I'm sick of performing at these half-assed events, and all I ever get on the question and answers is about Watergate." Brennan then tells him that the Frost interviews are going to proceed after all, and the president will be able to set the record straight there. He tells Nixon that the 4 90-minute shows will cover in equal measure Nixon the man, his domestic achievements, his foreign achievements, and, inevitably, Watergate.
Frost got there. He got the money.
What?
I understand most of it's borrowed, that his friends have bailed him out. But the point is, we start taping at the end of March.
Really? Now that's terrific. How much time is devoted to Watergate?
25%. Just 1 of 4 90-minute shows.
Now, the factors come together. Now, that's a good thing, no?
Mr. President, it's fantastic. Frost is just not in your intellectual class, sir. You're going to be able to dictate terms, rebuild your reputation.
Hey, you know what would be an interesting thing to find out? What his strategy is. Now, where's he staying?
I believe the Beverly Hilton.
Oh, the Beverly Hilton, you say? Well, I got the numbers someplace. There's some fellas that we could send in, Cubans with CIA training. Jesus, Jack, it was a joke.
Yes, sir.
And Jack Brennan staring at him, aren't they, going,
Don't know where to look.
"What?" And he turns around and says, "I was joking." It's like, I'm not sure you were.
Well, that's a neat device to tell us about the 4 topics that actually were covered in the Frost interviews. The movie makes a big deal that the last 2 interview sessions would contribute to the fourth broadcast about Watergate, and the flow of the movie suggests that everything builds up to this climax, and there'd be this, maybe an epiphany on camera after everything has been recorded, every other minute of the interviews has been dealt with. Well, not giving too much away, that's exactly what happens in the movie, but in reality, the Watergate sessions were discussed near the middle of the recording sessions. Out of the 12 sessions, Watergate was sessions 8 and 9, and in Frost's own book of the interviews, he says he can't quite understand why both the play and the movie shifted around the timeline, thinking it doesn't actually add much. But as I think you would agree, it actually does. I mean, playing with that narrative sequence and having the crescendo at Watergate, it works fantastic in the movie, but in reality, Watergate was filmed and discussed and broadcast 3/4 of the way in, not on the very last session. Minor,
absolutely.
Minor straying from the history to add to some decent dramatic tension, I think.
Well, I think the climax of the movie is the over the Watergate things where spoiler alert, Frost will attempt to wring a confession from the president, and that's the climax of the movie because it's the most key part of that series of interviews. And if you put it in the middle, inevitably you're going to end with a bit of an anticlimax. So I think it's fair dramatic license being taken there.
More than forgivable, I think.
We then see John Burton and James Reston having some flashback conversations to tell us that the whole team had set up for many months at the Beverly Hills Hilton preparing for the interviews. They divvy up the research on the 4 topics amongst them and Frost, but Reston tells us slightly critically that they didn't see much of David Frost because he kept up his showbiz duties and his jet-setting lifestyle. And we see a series of montage scenes of the research team typing, swapping findings, sharing takeaway meals and room service late into the night. And they're trying to research questions and possible answers that Nixon might give. But you do get the feeling that I think we're meant to get the impression that David Frost isn't really taking it all very seriously. He's not as driven. All he wants is to get himself on television with the former president.
Yeah.
He doesn't seem that bothered about what they're going to do when they get there.
That's right. He's shown in the movie as this attitude of, it'll be right on the night, we'll figure it all out, we'll sort of do 80% of the work and make the other 20% up, whereas the rest of the team are taking this as deathly serious and they feel that their journalistic reputations are on the line, which there's more that's pretty accurate to the truth from what I can find.
But I definitely would say, I mean, even at this stage, we should probably leave for the summary, but if people haven't seen a film, it is incredibly watchable. It really is a very well-made film.
And we've said this a lot about the films that we've reviewed, like Selma and others. There's no romance, there's no soaring music, there's no explosions, but it is a very good film. Talking heads, close-ups, it really is a very entertaining film. We're getting ahead of ourselves, but we're putting it into the 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10 bracket, aren't we?
Definitely. So back to the movie. Frost appears closer to the interview, achieving them, and Reston tells him about a hunch he has on some information that everyone might have missed from the infamous Nixon Oval Office tapes. He said, "It'll take me about a week to investigate it." And Frost pretty much laughs him off, saying, "Oh, we can't afford to lose you for a week," so he cancels the idea. Jack Brennan then calls in, trying to change the terms of their agreement, so the one Watergate episode will cover everything shady about the Nixon administration, not just the break-in and the cover-up. This would include the separate Nixon administration scandals of the Pentagon Papers, see HBH episode 38, The Post, the Nixon enemies list, the Plumbers Union scandal, and so on. When Frost refuses, Brennan tries to pull out the whole deal, at which point Frost threatens to sue Nixon over $20 million for the fees already paid and loss of earnings. Brennan is outraged at the disrespect Frost is showing to the ex-president, saying, "Look, 60% of what Nixon did in office was the right thing to do. 30% was proved wrong, but only over time, but was well-intentioned." So Frost then pauses and very effectively says, "So that means that 10% of his actions were wrong, and he knew it was wrong," at which point an outraged Jack Brennan hangs up. He kind of led himself down the street there, didn't he?
Well, in reality, I don't know. I'm pretty sure that the 60-30-10 conversation happened, but the actual phone call from Brennan at that last minute, the 11th hour renegotiation, that is true. And that's just how it, according to Frost's 2007 book. So they really did try and corral this everything bad, which there were several things, as we've said, including the Pentagon Papers, into the one Watergate topic. And they were unsuccessful, and as the movie shows, Frost said he'd countersue for many, many millions of dollars, and they had to reluctantly accept the terms and conditions that they'd already agreed to and received money for, at least $200,000 that we've seen in the movie. One smaller side is that, you get Kevin Bacon does a really good job as the fiercely loyal and tough ex-aide to White House. I think it was Chief of Staff, and he stayed with him after he left the White House, after Nixon left the White House. And he does a really good job. He's stern, he's tough, he's loyal. But according to Diane Sawyer, who's the blonde female journalist in the Entourage, she has said that the movie does him a great disservice, that he wasn't such a hard ass. He was a lovely guy, quick with a joke, very enjoyable, very pleasant, loyal and fierce as the movie shows, but maybe not quite as tough and grumpy as the movie.
No, I read an interview with Caroline Cushing, and she said that actually Jack Brennan said he was a delightful character. He said even though he was an adversary of theirs in a way, she said we were very conscious that this charming guy was probably quite very clever and therefore could be dangerous. She said, but he never seemed to employ underhand methods. He wasn't, acting with bonhomie to get under our skin. She said he was just a genuinely really nice bloke. He said, yes, he was loyal to Richard Nixon, but she said, I found him entirely charming. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that bears out Diane Sawyer's observation, so yeah, thanks for that.
So, back to the movie. In the next scene, we learn that this is the evening before the first interview session, and yet Caroline and David Frost, dressed to the nines in like black ties, say farewell to the team. Reston and Zelnick are horrified. They're saying, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, we're going to a movie premiere of a light-hearted film I've produced. Sorry, it's an obligation. I've got to go." So the two researchers are not feeling good about the success of the project, and they're concerned about their long-term journalistic reputations. We then see Nixon and his team also preparing for the next day, and they're watching live TV with Frost at the movie premiere. The Nixon team, you can see them, they're very cheerful and confident because they see him as a showbiz lightweight. David Frost, that is, as a showbiz lightweight.
Yeah, that's good, setting the scene before the first interview, and I guess he was a film producer. He may well have been called out to the premiere, but I don't really have any comment about how accurate that actually was. But it does set the scene well for the next day.
And much as I hate to interrupt, Andrew, that is all we've got time for this week. We'll be back next week with the second and final part of the Frost-Nixon show. I'm afraid it is only going to make 2 weeks. So the week after is going to be a fallow week, and we'll be back on the 16th of February with Social Network. But don't worry, we will be back next week. And to see us out, interestingly, this is theme music from the David Frost show in the 60s, written by George Martin of Beatles fame. That's going to play us out, and we'll speak to you next week. Thank you very much, and goodbye.